Hey everyone, let's compare and order rational numbers. By the end, you'll be like, Miss Madsen, give me any set of rational numbers and I'll put them in order for you. I'll be like, sweet, do all my work for me. So today you are going to see a lot of inequalities. That's a word I want you to know. What is an inequality? It's basically a number sentence that compares using either the less than symbol or the greater than symbol. So anytime you see a math sentence that has those symbols, then you know it's an inequality. Okay, so let's review. If you see an alligator mouth and you have these teeth staring at you, that means it is greater than. That's kind of how I remember the greater than symbol. Is the alligator is, if as you're reading left to right, you come and you see the alligator right on. Okay. Now this is, I like to think of it as an L that's been smooshed. So the L that looks smooshed is the less than symbol. If that works for you, then awesome. If you need to figure out some other way to remember that this is greater than and this symbol is less than, figure it out, but you need to know the difference. So here are my tips for today. My very first tip, if we are comparing two numbers, if one is positive and one is negative, boom, you already know your answer, right? The negatives are always going to be less than the positives. So this first example right here, this is in your notes, by the way. The first example right here, I have negative 3.5 being compared to 1.5. Well, of course, the negative 1.5, the negative 3.5 is less than the positive 1.5. So the alligator is going to always go and eat the positive number. Okay. Another thing you can do, tip number 2, is to look at the integers. In this next example, both of the numbers are negative. So then look at the whole number in front. Look at the integer in front. One is negative 4, one is negative 6. Well, negative 4 is greater than negative 6. It's closer to 0. It's further on the right than negative 6, so it is greater. Okay, so there's the second tip. Tip number 3 is to kind of compare it to half. If they are both positives or both negatives, and if they are both the same integer, then you're going to have to head into the fraction or decimal part of it. And if one fraction is less than half and one decimal is greater than half, then you can compare that way. For example, 2 2500ths is less than half. Okay, and 2/3 is greater than half. So I can see that negative 2/3 is a bigger negative than negative 1/4 or negative 2500ths. So even though this is a smaller number because it's negative, it's actually the bigger one. Remember that? Okay, so my final tip is if you're unsure, you still haven't quite figured it out 100% certain if one number is bigger than the other, then change them both to decimals. Here's 5.5, it's already a decimal. 3/4 I know is 0.75. So if I compare those, now that they are both decimals, I can line them up beautifully like this. And then I can see that the 7 and the 5 are different. The tenths are different. So the 3/4 is bigger than the 0.5. So those are my tips for how to compare and order rational numbers. And what we need to do now is just practice those tips. And I kind of like looking at them in order. So the first thing I always look for is I always look for the positive and negative numbers. Okay, and then I kind of work my way down from there. Real fast though, let's remember that if we're comparing two negatives, the bigger negative is actually smaller. Okay, because we're going to be comparing negatives today, and you got good with ordering and comparing negative integers. Now we're adding negative rational numbers to that mix. So just let's practice, okay? All right, so here's my first two numbers that I'm going to compare. And the first thing I always want to look for is there a difference in the positive and the negative numbers? And there is. So my alligator will always go towards the positive number. That is always the first thing I check for, because if the signs are different, then I am done. I don't even have to look at any of that part. All I have to see is one's negative, one's positive. I know positive's bigger. Okay, here's another example. I've got two fractions here that I might be like, oh, do I have to compare them? No, I don't, because one is positive and one is negative, and the alligator will always eat the positive one. So the way you'll say this is 1/3 is greater than negative 2/5. The way you would say the way you would have said this is negative 3/10 is less than 2/10. Okay, so when we need to compare them or order them, if we have two or more, it's called ordering. We have three numbers here that we're going to order, and they want it in this order. That's a less than symbol. So they want it from least to greatest. As I look, I'm still, even with more than two numbers, I'm still looking to see if there's a difference in the positive and the negatives. And there is one positive number is all. The other two are negatives. So that tells me that 3.6 is going to be the greatest number. Now what I'm going to look for is the whole number is front, the integer in front, right? So I have a -7 and a -5. I don't even have to look at the decimal part of this because I can already tell that they're different. -7 is more negative than -5. -7 is the smallest. And then -5 is a little bit closer to 0, a little more to the right, and then 3.6 is the furthest to the right. So I didn't even need to do anything with those fractions and decimals because the integers were different. All right, so these are both negatives, so that doesn't help me at all. If we look at the integer in front, neither of them have an integer in front. They're both 0 and something, so that doesn't help us. If we were to compare it to half, well, 3/4 is bigger than half, and 7/10 is bigger than half as well, right? Because half is 0.5. So that doesn't help us. So now let's change them to decimals. 0.7 is already a decimal. Good job. And we already know what 3/4 is as a decimal. We know that it is 0.75. So now that they are both decimals, we've got them lined up and we can compare. There's 0, the same, and 7 the same, and here we go. We got a 0 and a 5 in the hundredths place. The 5, the 75 hundredths, is the most negative number, isn't it? Because it's the biggest negative. So the biggest negative is the smallest number. So we're going to say that -3/4, which was 75 hundredths, is less than -7/10. You see how going through these steps makes it so it's very clear what's greater and what's less? Okay, so let's go through these steps again. Do we have any differences in positive and negatives? We do. We have a -1/4. So that is going to be the smallest number. And then I don't even have to worry about that one anymore. Then we have 2/3 and 5/12. They're both between 0 and 1, right? So the integers are the same. Compare it to half. They're both maybe bigger than half, maybe less than half. When in doubt, like I am right now, if I can't really visualize what 5/12 looks like, then I'm just going to resort to changing them to decimals because that will always be very clear. I'll have it lined up. It'll be very clear to see which one's bigger than the other. Plus, I already know what 2/3 is, right? I know that 2/3 is 0.66 repeating. So really the only work I have to do is how many times can 12 go into 50? And the answer is 4. And there will be a remainder. I could keep going, but honestly, if I line it up, I don't need to go any further because I already have a difference in the tenths place. So I can see that 4/10 is smaller than 66 hundredths. So, and did you see how I matched up? I went back, even though I had written 0.66 here, I went back and put 2/3 there. And then even though this was 0.4, I changed it to 5/12 because that's what was right there. So once you change things to decimals, then in your final answer, if it started as a fraction, move it back to a fraction. Okay, so that is our order from least to greatest with that set of numbers. All right, we got a couple more, and I would love it if you tried it on your own. Pause it, try it on your own, see how you do, push play, and then I'll talk you through it. So I have a little hint here. These are all negative, so I have to think in my mind, what is the biggest negative, and put that at the smallest end, right? Because these numbers that are furthest from 0 on the negative side are the smallest ones. Excuse me. So they're all negatives. I'm going to have to resort to looking at the integer in front. -5, -6, -5. I do have a difference with this -6. So I know that -6.5 is the smallest. Done. Now I need to compare a -5 1/4 and a -5.3. They're both less than half, so I'm going to go straight to turning it into a decimal. And I know that 1/4 is 0.2500. If I want, I can add a 0 there to compare 25 to 30. And I got to remind myself I'm looking for the biggest negative to make sure that that is the least number. And -5.30 is further in the negative side, the -5.25, isn't it? So I'm going to put -5.3 as the next smallest, or the next furthest from 0. And then as we're moving closer to 0, we're going to hit -5 1/4, which was 25 hundredths, wasn't it? Oh, I'm covering. There we go. There's the answer. Okay, so looking at our final example, they're all negatives. They don't have, they have a 0 for the integer. They're all, I don't know where they are compared to half. I'm just going to change them all to decimals. And that's going to be the easiest thing for my brain to work. Okay, maybe you can maybe you're really good at visualizing. I'm not so much. And these fractions I already have memorized, so they're kind of easy for me to do. -75 hundredths for 3/4, -5/10 for 1/2, and then 2/5 I don't have memorized, but fifths are always really easy because there's always only 1 0. Oh my gosh, I'm covering it up again. There we go. Fifths are always really nice to do because all you need is the 1 0 and it will always go in evenly. So then we have a -0.4. Maybe I'll add some zeros so they're all lined up. And I've got, so I basically have -40, -50, -75 hundredths. And I have to think, what is the biggest negative? The biggest negative is the 75 hundredths. Oh, look at this. They changed the sign. That's no longer a less than symbol, is it? That is now the greater than symbol. The alligator wants to eat the greatest number. So now I have to think which one is the greatest, which one is the furthest on the right, which one is the closest to 0. That's the -4/10. Oops, which is -2/5, isn't it? Okay, and then as we go further to the left, we're going to hit the -1/2, which was the 5/10, and then we'll hit the -3/4. That is the one that is the furthest from 0. Okay, ooh, I'm glad I checked that. Awesome. All right, let's do a little test prep. When you see a question like this, I have a lot of kids that are like, which list shows the least to greatest? And they're like, okay, well, Moncton is -7. Is that bigger than Somerville? And then Hill, and then, well, no, what about, there's, And and they're looking at just the options. What I want you to do is ignore the options, just figure out the answer, and then you can match it up. So instead of looking here, let's look where the numbers actually are. Okay, so which one is it says least to greatest, doesn't it? So the least out of all of these will be that -7, right? It's the only one that's -7. Then we have two -6s. So then we'll have -6, is it 7 or 1 that's further from 0? It's the -7 that's furthest from 0. And then it'll be -6.1. And then the greatest of all of these is the only one that's the -5. Okay, so now what I can do is I can go Moncton, Somerville, Gadsby, and Hillen. Now that I know the answer, now I can match the answer. And it's not A or B. I want MSGH, MSGH. That is the correct answer. Okay? All right, friends, now you know how to compare and order rational numbers. Have fun with this. I have lots of games and practice for you to do. And I'll check off your master check once you get it turned in. See ya.